South Dakota's small town slept under the kind of silence that people from bigger cities dreamed about, the kind of silence that felt safe, warm, and familiar, a place where everyone knew each other's names, where front doors stayed unlocked, where kids rode their bikes through quiet streets without looking over their shoulders, where neighbors waved to each other every morning with genuine smiles, where fear felt like something that happened somewhere else, far away, never here, not in this little town, not under this clear sky, not between these fields. The houses were old but cared for. White fences stood clean, swings creaked gently in backyards, and the night smelled of rain and soil, soft and harmless. But behind this calm, behind those friendly faces and summer nights, something was moving quietly. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't a stranger passing through. It was something much closer. It was a storm growing behind one innocent face that no one thought twice about. The boy was small, thin, with soft blonde hair that caught the light when he walked past the corner store, the kind of child you would think of as shy, maybe a little quiet but harmless. Every day he walked home from school alone, passing the same row of houses, the same gas station with its buzzing neon sign, the same old church bell that rang at 6. He smiled when neighbors waved at him, nodded politely, answered softly when adults asked about school. They thought he was a good boy, respectful, a little odd maybe, but sweet. They had no idea what thoughts lived behind those quiet eyes. At night, when the town closed its doors and streetlights hummed low, he didn't sleep like other kids. He watched. He listened. And most of all, he imagined. His house was just like the others, a small white building with a porch, a cracked step, and flowers planted neatly by the front door. Inside it smelled like soap and old wood. His mother worked 2 jobs and was rarely home before midnight. His father wasn't there anymore. Neighbors said he'd left. Some whispered darker stories, but no one really knew. What they did know was that the boy often stayed alone in that house. And no one thought much of it. Small towns trusted each other too much. The boy liked the quiet. He liked how the town went still at night, how the wind moved through the fields like a whisper, how the streetlights painted long shadows on the road. Most children were afraid of the dark. He wasn't. The dark didn't scare him because the dark wasn't empty. He understood it. He belonged to it. While other kids dreamt of monsters hiding under their beds, he knew monsters didn't live under beds at all. They lived inside people. Inside him, it started small. It always starts small. A bird with a broken wing, a cat left behind a shed, things he found on the edge of town where no one looked too closely. He liked watching things struggle. He liked the silence that followed. And no one noticed because no one thought to look at a quiet boy with soft hair and polite smiles. Teachers said he was quiet but smart. Neighbors said he was lonely but good. Everyone said something nice about him, but no one really saw him. In the daytime, he sat in class, drawing pictures in the corner of his notebooks, shapes that made no sense to others but felt like a language only he understood. A house with no windows, a forest with no birds, a figure standing alone. His teacher once asked him why he never drew people, why his pictures always felt empty. He just smiled. She didn't ask again. It's easy to miss a monster when it looks like a child. Every night he walked to the edge of the cornfields. He liked the way the tall stalks moved like breathing walls, how they whispered secrets when the wind touched them. He liked standing there, feeling like he was part of something bigger. He didn't bring a flashlight. He didn't need one. He knew every sound in those fields, every shape, every shadow. He liked the dark because in the dark no one asked questions. No one watched. The people in town told themselves scary stories sometimes late at night over coffee. They talked about old crimes, about strangers that passed through, about shadows moving down the highway, but they never talked about one of their own. That was too hard to imagine. Monsters came from outside. They didn't grow up next door. They didn't eat lunch at the same cafeteria. They didn't wave on their way home from school, but the signs were always there. People just didn't want to see them. The missing pets, the sounds in the night, the strange drawings the kids whispered about at recess. The boy's classmates thought he was weird but harmless. One of them said she'd seen him behind the gym one afternoon with something red on his hands. But she told no one, because what would they say? He was just a kid. The boy walked differently when no one was watching. At night his steps were slower, quieter, like he was part of the dark itself. He liked walking past the houses and imagining what was inside. Which door was unlocked? Which room was farthest from the parents? Which house had a loose window latch? It wasn't just curiosity, it was something deeper. A hunger that made him feel more alive than anything else. He learned early that fear had a sound. It wasn't screaming. Screaming was loud and messy. Fear lived in quiet places, in held breaths, in footsteps that froze on wooden floors, in the way air trembled before a whisper. He liked that sound. He liked the idea of being the cause of that sound. And he knew no one would ever suspect him. Because who would look at a 12-year-old boy and think killer? The town celebrated small things often. Birthday parades, pie contests, church fairs. He liked those too, but not for the same reasons others did. He liked watching people smile, seeing how their faces softened when they felt safe. It made imagining the opposite so much better. He liked to pick someone in the crowd, follow them with his eyes, imagine the fear that would replace that smile if they ever found themselves alone with him in the dark. People said he had a kind face. That was the thing about monsters. They don't always look like monsters. Sometimes they look like children holding balloons at a summer fair. Sometimes they stand in your living room and ask for a glass of water. Sometimes they wave goodnight and smile like angels. The town thought it was safe. That was its first mistake. Safety makes people blind. It makes them leave windows open at night. It makes them trust quiet faces. It makes them believe nothing bad can happen here. But bad things don't need permission to happen. They don't knock on the door. They wait, they watch. They grow in silence. The boy's room was small, clean, like every other child's room. Posters on the wall. A shelf with books. A bed with a blue blanket. But under the bed, hidden in a small box, were things no one knew about. Tiny bones. Buttons from jackets. Small things no one would miss. Trophies, but not the kind a child should have. The police station had a single front desk, 2 old patrol cars, and officers who spent more time dealing with drunk farmers than real crime. Nothing bad ever happened here. That was the story they told themselves. And the boy liked that story, because it kept everyone asleep. He moved like a shadow through that town. He knew which porches creaked, which backyards had dogs, which windows had broken locks. He wasn't guessing. He learned it all, patiently, quietly, like someone building a puzzle piece by piece. No one saw the storm growing because storms don't always come with thunder. Sometimes they come with soft smiles and silent footsteps. Sometimes the monster sits 2 desks behind your child in class and hums a song you never bothered to listen to. The boy wasn't in a hurry. That was the terrifying part. He didn't want to make noise. He wanted to make a story that no one would forget. He wanted them to remember the silence, not the scream. And on one still night, when the moon hung low and the cornfields whispered his name, he made his choice. He picked the first house, a house that trusted the night too much, a house that thought nothing could touch it, a house that never imagined the danger would walk in on 2 small feet. The real monster of that town didn't crawl out of the forest. It walked out of a white house with a cracked step. It wore soft sneakers and a quiet smile. It waved politely when neighbors passed by. It went to bed on time. It said yes, ma'am, and no, sir, and no one ever saw it coming. In the years that followed, people would look back and say they should have known. They should have seen it. The signs were right there. But the truth is, people don't look for monsters in children. They don't search for shadows in kind faces. They don't lock their doors against the smile of a boy who hasn't even turned 12. The night was quiet. The boy's eyes were colder than the wind, and the story of the town was about to change forever, because what they thought was a peaceful place was about to learn that evil doesn't always come with a roar. Sometimes it comes in silence. The first incident didn't shake the town at first, because it was small, quiet, and easy to explain away, like a shadow that slips past the corner of your vision when you're not really paying attention. It began with the Wilson family's dog, a big golden retriever that everyone in the neighborhood loved, a dog that barked at passing cars and greeted every child with a wagging tail, the kind of dog that made people feel safe just by being around. And one morning he was gone, the leash hanging loose on the fence post, the gate wide open even though Mr. Wilson swore he had locked it the night before. The neighbors helped search, walking through fields and dirt roads calling the dog's name, children holding flashlights with sleepy eyes, mothers whispering that maybe he'd run off after a deer, and no one thought anything worse because bad things didn't happen here, not in this quiet town. But the boy had watched it all from across the street, standing by the edge of his yard like a statue, his hands in his pockets, his eyes calm, not a trace of concern on his face. He had seen the dog the night before, not wandering, not lost, but tied up behind the tool shed near the edge of the cornfield. The animal's breathing fast, eyes wide, its trust slowly draining away. The boy didn't take it for food or to be cruel for no reason. He took it because he wanted to see something, to feel something, to watch the moment when something alive realized it couldn't escape, and no one ever looked at him twice that morning. They just assumed he was another worried child watching grown-ups look for something they'd never find. 2 weeks later, it was the Hendersons' barn, its window shattered clean, as if someone had pushed their way in without breaking more glass than needed. A few chickens were gone, not stolen for money or food, but just gone. No footprints, no tracks, no signs of coyotes or stray dogs. The sheriff, a man with a round belly and sleepy eyes, said it was probably a fox. Everyone nodded, because it was easier to believe in a fox than something else, easier to keep the idea of safety alive than to look too closely. But the boy had been there again. He'd been there hours before the Hendersons found the broken glass. He liked the sound of bones snapping in the quiet of the barn, the way animals stilled when they understood they were trapped. He'd been careful. He'd always been careful. Every incident was small: a missing pet, a dead rabbit behind a shed, a rusted knife found near a fence. None of it made headlines. None of it felt big enough to shake the faith people had in their little town. But together they formed a pattern, a story written in silence, and the only one who could read it was the boy who had written it with his own hands. He walked down Main Street with that same small smile, carrying his school bag like any other kid, waving to the mailman, nodding to the old woman who sold fresh pies, while hidden beneath that soft mask was a creature learning how to kill without ever getting caught. At school, his classmates started to whisper things they didn't understand. One girl, small and quiet, said she saw him crouching near the field after dark. Another boy swore he found a small animal skinned near the playground tree. But children's words in small towns are like wind, soft, scattered, never taken seriously. The teachers brushed it off. The sheriff laughed. Parents told their kids to stop making up ghost stories. But the boy listened to those whispers with quiet satisfaction, because whispers are powerless when no one listens. He started spending more time outside at night. He liked how the town fell asleep, how the streets stretched out empty and cold, how the wind made the trees sound like they were breathing, how even the dogs stopped barking after midnight. He would walk barefoot sometimes, feeling the cool ground beneath him, memorizing every creak in the neighborhood's fences, every light that stayed on too late, every porch step that moaned under weight. He didn't need to rush. He had time. Monsters always do. The first time a scream cut through the night, it was just a child, a little boy from down the road who said he saw something moving by the trees. His mother hushed him, kissed his forehead, locked the door, told him it was just a bad dream. The neighbors laughed about it the next day over coffee, but the boy who caused that scream didn't laugh. He stood by the swings at the edge of the schoolyard, watching the other children play, silent, his head slightly tilted like he was studying something no one else could see. He began to leave little marks, small enough not to be noticed but clear enough for him to remember. Scratches on fences, bent nails, a shoe print just out of place. It was like he was testing the town, testing how far he could push before anyone saw the shape of the shadow standing right in front of them. And each time they didn't see. They didn't want to. The Wilson family put up a new fence. The Hendersons set traps near the barn. A few people even started locking their doors at night, which they hadn't done in years, but none of it mattered, because they still believed whatever was happening was small. A fox, a stray dog, a wild raccoon, something they could fix with wood and nails and new locks. They didn't realize it wasn't an animal that walked through their streets at night. It was something far worse, and it lived right among them. One evening, as the sun sank behind the horizon, painting the sky red, the boy stood at the end of Maple Street looking at the houses lined up like soft targets. His eyes lingered on the Johnsons' house longer than the others. It had a side door that never fully latched. He knew because he had tested it 3 times already. They had 2 kids, both younger than him, a dog that barked too much and a father who worked night shifts. He memorized their schedule like a hunter memorizes the path of its prey. That same night, Mrs. Johnson heard something outside. A soft rustle, the sound of something brushing against the side of the house. Her husband wasn't home. The kids were asleep upstairs. She told herself it was just the wind. Everyone tells themselves it's just the wind. She checked the window and saw nothing but the street light flickering. But what she didn't know was that 10 feet away, Hidden behind the old oak tree, the boy stood barefoot in the grass, watching the house, counting every second she hesitated before locking the door. He liked that moment. The moment when fear touched someone but didn't stay long enough to grow. It would grow later. He would make sure of it. The town sheriff held a short meeting at the diner the next day. A few families gathered. He told them to keep an eye out for animals, reminded them not to leave trash outside, to close their barns. They nodded, grateful for someone to blame. No one talked about the whispers, about the strange marks, about the feeling some people had when they stepped outside at night. The feeling of being watched. Fear was there now, soft, faint like smoke in the air. But fear alone isn't dangerous. What's dangerous is when fear is ignored. The boy liked how things were changing. He liked that people were starting to sleep less soundly. He liked the way their curtains stayed shut at night, the way their flashlights swept the darkness nervously. He liked that he had built this without anyone knowing it was him. He was just a quiet boy who walked to school like everyone else. Who said thank you when handed candy at the store. Who sat at the front of church and folded his hands just right. And on the night of the first storm of the season, when thunder rolled over the fields and the rain whispered against the windows, the boy smiled to himself in the dark, lying in his bed, listening to the town breathing through its fear. Because this was only the beginning. What he'd done so far was nothing compared to what he had planned. And no one suspected a thing. The night the Johnson family vanished began like any other night in that quiet little town. The kind of night where the wind moved softly through the cornfields and the streetlights hummed with a low, steady buzz. The kind of night where nothing terrible was supposed to happen. But monsters don't wait for thunder or lightning. Sometimes they move in silence through unlocked doors and familiar shadows. And that night the boy moved like the darkness itself, quiet, calm, and invisible. The Johnson house was warm and alive that evening. The yellow porch light flickering gently, the smell of dinner still hanging in the kitchen, soft music playing low in the background, two little kids laughing upstairs as their mother cleaned up, and their father heading out for his night shift at the factory like he always did. It was an ordinary night for them, but it wasn't for him. He had watched this house for weeks. He knew what time the father's car left, what time the mother turned off the kitchen light, how long it took for the kids' laughter to fade into sleep, and how the side door never locked right. It was his favorite house because it trusted the night too much. He stood across the street under the old oak tree where he had stood many nights before, barefoot, his breath steady, his hands still. And when the last light in the living room went out, he started walking slow and careful, like he'd done this 100 times. The storm hadn't begun yet, but it was coming. The Johnson dog barked once, just once, then silence. The mother, already upstairs, assumed it was the wind again, the same way she always did. She never imagined that the thing outside wasn't a stray animal. It was a boy with pale eyes who knew how to open the side door without making a sound. The hinges creaked softly, but the storm outside covered it like a blanket. He slipped inside the house without hesitation. No flashlight, no weapon drawn like in movies, just his steady breathing and the slow rhythm of footsteps that never rushed. The house was familiar to him. He had memorized every creak in the floorboards, every turn in the hallway, every shadow. He moved past the kitchen, where the plates were still wet in the drying rack, past the family photos on the wall, the smiling faces staring at him from frozen moments, their joy captured on film, their future already erased. He reached the foot of the staircase and stopped, listening. Upstairs he heard the soft thump of someone turning in bed. He liked that sound. It meant they were still asleep. It meant the story was still his to write. The first person to see him was the mother. She woke up to a sound she couldn't explain, a whisper of movement in a house that should have been still. At first she thought it was the wind again, the same excuse that had kept her safe for weeks. But something felt wrong. It wasn't loud, but it was there, a pressure in the air. She stepped out of her bedroom and whispered her children's names, but there was no answer. That's when she saw the shape at the end of the hallway, small, motionless, a child. She almost called out a name. She almost convinced herself it was her own son standing there in the dark. But then it tilted its head slowly and she knew. Fear has a sound. It's not a scream. It's the sound of breath catching in a throat. The soft rustle of someone stepping back without meaning to. The way air freezes in the lungs before the voice comes. She felt it in her bones, that wrongness, that cold crawling terror that no mother should ever have to feel in her own home. She didn't scream right away. She didn't even move. She stared at the boy's face in the dim light. A face too calm, too empty, like a doll someone had left standing in the hallway. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. He just walked forward one step at a time like he'd rehearsed it. She turned and ran toward her children's room, her heart beat louder than the rain beginning to tap against the window. She threw open the door to find both kids awake, sitting upright, their small faces pale because they had heard him too. They had heard the quiet. Children understand fear faster than adults do. Downstairs, the side door moved again. A soft thump like the house itself was breathing wrong. She slammed the bedroom door shut and turned the lock with shaking hands, whispering to her children to stay quiet, to stay close, to not make a sound. But the boy had already learned how locks worked in this house. He had watched her use them. He had tested the weak spots on nights when no one knew he was there. And now he turned the knob slowly, listening to the way her breath caught on the other side. The town would never know the details of what happened next. Not really, because by morning, the Johnson house was quiet, too quiet. The front porch light still glowing softly, the father's truck parked in the same place it always was, the curtains still drawn, the breakfast plate still on the counter, but no voices came from inside, no footsteps, no laughter, just silence thick enough to choke. The neighbor across the street noticed first. She waved that morning, expecting the Johnson kids to run out to the bus stop like they always did, but no one came out. She waited 5 minutes, then 10. Then she knocked on the door. No answer. The door was unlocked. She pushed it open and called their names, and the silence inside the house was heavy and cold, like the air itself didn't belong to them anymore. The sheriff arrived 20 minutes later, scratching his head as he walked through the kitchen and saw nothing broken, nothing out of place, no sign of a break-in, no signs of a struggle. Just a house frozen in time, as if the family had simply walked out in the middle of the night. The kids' shoes were still by the door, the mother's purse still on the counter, the father's jacket hanging on its hook. Whispers spread through town fast like they always do when something terrible happens in a place that isn't used to terrible things. Some said they packed up and ran away. Some said it was an accident. Some said maybe they were taken by strangers. No one said it out loud, but everyone felt it. Something had come into that house. Something had taken everything. The boy walked to school that morning like nothing had happened, his face calm, his step steady, his school bag on his back. He passed the flashing police lights without flinching. He passed the sheriff's car, the yellow tape going up around the Johnsons' yard, the neighbors whispering and clutching their coats. He walked right through it like he belonged there because he did. That was the scariest part. Monsters don't always hide in shadows. Sometimes they walk in plain sight with clean hands and blank eyes. At school, he sat at his desk near the window. His teacher was late because of the news. His classmates whispered about the missing family, their voices shaking, some pretending they weren't scared, others refusing to talk at all. One girl, the same quiet girl who once said she saw him near the fields, glanced at him and froze. She didn't know why, but something in his stillness made her throat close. He didn't speak. He didn't smile. He just stared out the window where the sheriff's car passed down the road again. The search went on for days. Volunteers combed the woods. Police set up roadblocks. Helicopters circled once, then left. But there were no signs. No footprints. No bodies. Nothing. The Johnsons had disappeared like they were never real, and the town clung to its old belief because that's what towns like this do. They tell themselves it can't be someone they know. It can't be a neighbor. It can't be a child, but the boy knew exactly what happened. He knew where they went. He knew how their screams had faded into the night, how the silence afterward had tasted sweet. He walked past the missing posters every day, reading the words as if they were written for someone else. Missing. Last seen at home. No sign of forced entry. They were looking for a ghost, and he was right there. The wind carried whispers down Maple Street at night. People started locking their doors a little tighter. Parents kept their kids closer, but they still didn't know. They still looked for strangers, for outsiders, for something that came from somewhere else. They never looked into the calm blue eyes of a boy who sat 2 desks away in school. And he liked it that way. This was no accident. This was his first masterpiece. And the worst part was no one even saw him holding the brush. The town had never seen anything like it before. One night a happy family simply vanished. No screams, no gunshots, no broken doors, just silence swallowing everything. And that silence was louder than any alarm ever could be. People locked their doors earlier now. They checked windows twice. They whispered to each other at the diner, their words trembling even though they tried to sound brave. This wasn't the kind of place where bad things happened. It wasn't supposed to be. And that was exactly why the fear spread so fast. Because deep down they knew something was wrong. Not out there on the highway, not in some faraway city, but here in their own streets breathing the same air as them. 3 days after the Johnsons disappeared, the town sheriff finally admitted he was in over his head. The missing posters, the volunteer searches, the roadblocks, none of it made sense anymore. And that's when they called him Detective Raymond Clark, a state investigator who had seen what darkness looks like when it wears a human face. He was tall, with deep lines around his eyes and the kind of stare that didn't look through people, but straight into them. He arrived in an old black sedan with nothing but a notebook, a flashlight, and a face that didn't believe in small-town innocence. He had seen too many small towns pretend they were safe until something ripped that illusion apart. When Clark walked into the Johnson house for the first time, the air inside felt wrong. It wasn't the smell of blood or broken things, it was the quiet, heavy and stale like the house itself had been holding its breath ever since that night. The plates were still on the counter, shoes still by the door, the kids' toys scattered on the carpet like life had been paused mid-movement. He walked through the room slowly, his boots whispering against the floor, every creak echoing too loud in the stillness. He knelt near the side door, ran his fingers along the edge, and found the loose latch the father had promised to fix but never did. No forced entry, no signs of struggle, just a door that might as well have been an invitation. The sheriff followed behind him, nervous, sweating under his hat, trying to talk, but Clark didn't answer. He was listening. The house was too clean. Whoever took them or whatever happened was quiet, precise, and fast. Clark turned toward the stairs. Halfway up, he stopped. Because there was something strange in the air, a faint scent, not of blood or rot, but of something clean, like the rain-soaked cornfields outside. It made his skin tighten. In the kids' room, 2 small beds were still unmade, a teddy bear lying face down on the floor. Clark crouched and touched the window frame. No broken glass, no forced entry there either. But when he leaned closer, he saw a faint smudge, something that looked like a print. Not quite a hand, not quite anything clear. As if whoever had been there had pressed softly against the glass without wanting to leave a trace. He'd seen prints like that before. Not in big cities where killers were sloppy, but in places where monsters liked to walk slowly and quietly, where they wanted to be unseen. He stepped outside after an hour of walking through the house, the sun already dipping low, throwing long shadows across the empty yard. The wind moved through the cornfields like it always did, gentle and soft. But to Clark, it didn't sound like wind, it sounded like breathing. He looked at the oak tree across the street without knowing why. Something about that spot made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. A shoe print in the soft dirt, small, too small to belong to a grown man. The sheriff didn't notice it. Clark didn't point it out. He just wrote it down in his notebook. He had learned long ago not to speak too soon, not in towns like this, where people's smiles could be masks. That night, Clark sat alone in the motel on the edge of town, the ceiling fan spinning slow above him, the case file open on the bed, the Johnson family's faces staring up from photographs that suddenly felt too normal, too soft. These weren't people who made enemies. These weren't people who crossed dangerous strangers. This wasn't a random attack. Something was watching them. Something had planned this. And that something was still here. The next day he walked through the town slowly, not asking questions like other detectives would, just watching. Small towns always talked when they thought no one was listening. He stood near the diner window, watching neighbors whisper at their tables. He saw how they avoided looking at each other too long. Fear was already eating them from the inside. It wasn't just fear of what had happened. It was fear of not knowing who. He visited the school next. It wasn't on the sheriff's list, but he trusted his instincts more than procedure. Something told him to look there. Kids saw things adults didn't. They spoke when they didn't understand what they'd seen. In the hallway, he watched them file past in lines, laughing, whispering, pretending their world hadn't just cracked open. But there was one boy who didn't laugh, who didn't whisper, who didn't look scared at all. The boy sat in the third row of the classroom, hands folded on his desk, staring out the window like the world outside belonged to him. When Clark entered the room, most of the children turned their heads, curious about the stranger in the dark coat. He didn't pay attention to them. He watched the boy, Because while everyone else looked uncertain, his face was still. Not bored. Not nervous. Just still. Like he didn't need to pretend to be afraid. The teacher introduced him, explained that he was helping find the missing family, asked the children if they'd seen anything strange. A few hands went up. One girl talked about a noise near the fields. A boy mentioned a shadow he thought was a fox. But the quiet boy in the third row said nothing. He didn't even blink when Clark's eyes met his. And something in that stare made Clark's jaw tighten. He'd seen that look before, not on children, but on men who had already crossed the line where empathy dies. After the bell, Clark stayed outside the school leaning against his car, pretending to write in his notebook. The boy walked out slowly, not running like the others, not talking, just walking with steady steps down Maple Street. Clark didn't follow him, not yet, but he watched the path he took, straight toward the oak tree, the same tree that had left an itch in Clark's mind. That night, Clark drove past the Johnson house again, the flashing lights gone, the tape fluttering softly in the wind. He turned off the engine and sat in the dark, watching the empty street. And then he saw him, just for a second. The same small figure standing near the tree, not moving, not hiding, just staring at the house like it was a memory only he understood. Clark's breath stilled. He'd hunted killers for years, and he knew the real monsters don't always run. Sometimes they stand perfectly still because they're not afraid of anyone. When Clark walked into the sheriff's office the next morning, his voice was quieter than usual. "This isn't a break-in," he said flatly. "This is someone who knows them, someone who knows us." He didn't mention the boy. Not yet, he needed to be sure. But in his gut he already was. The sheriff rubbed his forehead, muttering about outsiders, about vagrants and drifters, about how things like this don't happen here. Clark didn't argue. He just kept looking at the photo of the Johnson family on the wall. He had seen too many towns like this, where everyone trusted the quiet face in the corner, the one they thought was too young, too polite, too soft to do something truly monstrous. And outside, in that same classroom, the boy sat quietly at his desk, drawing another one of his strange, empty pictures. A house with no windows, a black shape at the door. No one noticed. No one ever did. But Clark was watching now, and the boy could feel it. 2 hunters in the same town, one hiding in plain sight, one closing in slowly. The storm that had started with silence was about to get louder. The days that followed felt strange in the little town, a mix of fear and routine, people trying to live like everything was fine, while their eyes betrayed them every time they looked at a dark window or an empty road. Children weren't allowed to play outside anymore. Porch lights stayed on all night, and whispers followed every shadow that passed too close to a house. Even the wind made people flinch now. It was like the air itself had changed, heavy, uneasy, alive with something they couldn't see. Detective Clark felt it too. The way fear seeps into a place and settles, quiet and patient the way guilt or rot does. And every night he drove the same roads through town, his headlights cutting through the fog, his radio off, his eyes always scanning. Because he could feel it, something was still here. Something watching back. He had started to see patterns, not in the clues left behind but in the silences. There was a rhythm to it, the missing pets, the soft scratches on barns, the nights when dogs refused to bark. Clark had hunted killers who left trails of blood. This one left quiet. It was the kind of thing that didn't show up in evidence. It showed up in the way people acted. How they avoided looking down certain streets. How the sheriff stopped driving past the Johnson house after dark. How even the church bells sounded wrong now, slower, softer, like the town was holding its breath. And somewhere in that breath Clark knew was the boy. He started visiting the school more often, pretending to check on safety, asking the teacher about routines, who walked home alone, who lived near the Johnsons, and always his eyes drifted toward the same desk by the window, where the boy sat drawing quietly while the others laughed and whispered. His drawings bothered Clark not because they were messy but because they weren't. Each line was careful, controlled, cold. They looked like maps of places that didn't exist, and in one of them Clark saw it. A familiar shape, a tree, an old oak with roots stretching like claws. The same tree across from the Johnson house, drawn perfectly from the right angle. He asked to see it. The boy looked up, his voice small and steady. "It's just a tree." And Clark smiled thinly. "Yeah, I know," but he didn't. That night, Clark sat in his motel room staring at that drawing he had borrowed, the lamp flickering over it, the paper slightly smudged at the corners where small fingers had pressed too long. He traced the outline of the house behind the tree with his thumb. There were no windows drawn, no lights, just black walls, empty, hollow. He leaned back and closed his eyes, and for the first time, he dreamed of the Johnsons, standing in that house, frozen in the dark, and outside that small figure watching, just watching. The sound of his own breathing woke him up before dawn, and he knew he was getting close. The next morning, he asked the sheriff to set up a night patrol on Maple Street, but the sheriff resisted, muttering about budgets, about making the town more scared than it already was. Clark didn't argue. He'd already planned to do it himself. He wasn't going to wait for permission. That evening, he parked his car near the old oak, engine off, lights out, just the sound of crickets and the distant hum of the power lines. It was quiet for hours until around midnight, when he saw movement, small, slow, deliberate, not a man, not a stray animal, a child barefoot walking down the middle of the street with something in his hand that glinted when it caught the faint light from the street lamp. Clark's heartbeat slowed, not faster, slower, like his body was preparing for something it already knew was coming. He watched the boy stop near the Johnson house, the one that had become a graveyard of whispers, and just stand there staring, his head tilted like he was listening to something Clark couldn't hear. Then he turned slightly, looking straight, toward the oak tree, toward Clark's car, not startled, not curious, just looking. As if he knew exactly where the detective was, Clark froze, his hand on his flashlight but not daring to move. The boy didn't smile, didn't run. He just walked away, slipping between the houses until the night swallowed him again. Clark stepped out of the car slowly, the air colder now, his breath fogging, and he looked down at the ground where the boy had stood. Faint footprints in the dust. Small, deliberate, the kind of prints left by someone who never rushed. The next morning, he went back to the school. The boy was there, sitting in his seat like nothing happened, drawing again. The same calm face, the same small hands moving carefully. Clark stood at the back of the class, watching, and when the boy looked up, their eyes met for the second time. Longer now. Heavier. Clark could see it. The absence behind those eyes. Not pain, not fear, just the kind of emptiness that doesn't belong in a child, the kind that belongs to something else, entirely. The teacher's voice broke the silence, calling Clark's name, asking if he needed anything. He blinked, looked away, forced a smile. Just routine, he said. But nothing about this was routine. That night he set the trap. Hidden cameras on the Johnson property, motion sensors near the old oak, everything wired to his car's receiver. It wasn't much, but it would be enough to see if the figure returned. Midnight came. The monitors flickered in the dark, static hissing softly. Clark sat in his car again, hands wrapped around a coffee cup gone cold, his eyes fixed on the screens. 1 minute passed, then another, then the motion light blinked once, and there he was again, the boy standing in the same place as before, head tilted slightly, staring straight at the empty house. Clark turned on the audio feed, and what he heard made his blood run cold. It wasn't talking, it wasn't singing, it was whispering. Soft, rhythmic, like a lullaby hummed without words. It went on for 30 seconds, then stopped. The boy looked toward the oak again, and this time, he smiled. Clark got out of the car, moving slow. Careful not to make noise, the air was thick, every sound sharp. He stepped closer, boots pressing against gravel. And the boy didn't move, didn't run. He just stood there, whispering something under his breath. Clark stopped about 10 feet away. "What are you doing out here?" His voice steady, quiet. The boy turned his head slightly, his eyes catching the faint light. "They're still here," he said softly. "They talked to me." Clark's grip tightened on his flashlight. "Who's here?" he asked, but the boy just smiled faintly. "You can't hear them." Then he stepped back into the dark, and by the time Clark reached the spot, he was gone, like smoke fading, into the wind. The cameras caught nothing but static after that. The motion sensors stopped working. Clark sat in his car until dawn, staring at the last frame of the boy's face frozen on the monitor, that half smile, calm and knowing, and for the first time in his career, Clark felt something he hadn't felt in years. Not fear of what he might find, but fear that maybe he'd already found it, and it was something he couldn't explain, couldn't arrest, couldn't save anyone from. The next day, the sheriff found him sitting outside the station, eyes red, hands shaking slightly from too much coffee and not enough sleep. "You look like hell, detective," the sheriff said, trying to joke, but Clark didn't laugh. "You ever look a monster in the eye and have it look back like it already knew you?" he said softly. The sheriff frowned. "You're saying it's the boy?" Clark didn't answer. He didn't need to, because deep down he knew it, and maybe, somehow the boy did too. That night, Clark loaded his revolver for the first time since he'd arrived. He wasn't sure why. Maybe instinct. Maybe something older than logic. The storm outside was rolling in again, thunder low and distant, the same as the night the Johnsons disappeared, and Clark whispered to himself as he sat in the dark, "Tonight, we end this." But somewhere across town, in a small white house with a cracked porch step, a boy stood at his window, watching the rain, smiling faintly, whispering back, "Yes, tonight we will." The storm rolled in like a warning that night, slow, heavy, dragging dark clouds over the quiet little town as if the sky itself wanted to bury what was about to happen. The air was thick. Every gust of wind carried a chill that crept into houses through cracks in windows, through keyholes and chimneys. It wasn't just the weather that made people uneasy. It was something else, something that sat deep in their chests, a weight they couldn't name. Mothers pulled their children. In early porch lights burned brighter, and the sheriff's old radio buzzed with nothing but static. Like the storm had swallowed every signal whole, Detective Clark sat alone in his car across from the Johnson house, the same house where this nightmare began, engine off, lights out, his hand resting on the handle of his revolver, not because he wanted to use it, but because a part of him already knew he might have to. The trap was set again, only this time it wasn't just cameras and sensors. Clark had spent the entire day wiring the place himself, walking every inch of the house and the tree line, memorizing the way the wind moved, the way shadows shifted. When the storm clouds passed over the streetlights, he could feel it building, like a pulse under the pavement, like something was waiting for the perfect moment to step out of hiding. His eyes kept drifting toward the oak tree, black against the storm sky, its branches swaying like long fingers reaching toward the house. And for the first time since arriving, Clark wasn't just a hunter anymore. He was bait. The first movement came just after midnight. Not loud, not dramatic, just a shape flickering at the edge of his vision, the kind of movement that makes your heart beat slow instead of fast, because your body recognizes danger before your mind does. He turned his head slowly and saw him, the boy, standing barefoot in the rain on Maple Street, the water soaking through his shirt, his hair sticking flat against his head. But his face was the same as always, calm, cold, too calm for a child standing in a storm. Clark didn't move, didn't open the car door, just watched. The boy tilted his head slightly, the way he always did, as if listening to something no one else could hear, and then he started walking toward the Johnson house. Clark's breath grew shallow. He reached for his flashlight but didn't turn it on. Instead, he opened the door quietly, stepping out into the rain, his boots sinking slightly into the mud. The thunder rolled somewhere far away, but the street was quiet, except for the soft patter of rain. The boy reached the oak tree and stopped beneath it, his small hand pressed against the bark like he was greeting an old friend. Clark stepped closer, slow and careful, his gun still holstered but his hand hovering above it, every nerve in his body alive with that sharp kind of instinct that only shows up when something isn't human anymore, even if it looks like a child. "Why here?" Clark's voice was low, cutting through the rain like a whisper. The boy didn't turn at first. He kept his hand on the tree, tracing small circles in the wet bark. When he finally spoke, his voice was soft, too soft for the storm. "Because they talked to me here," he said. Clark's skin crawled. "Who?" he asked. The boy turned then, and in the weak yellow glow from the streetlight, Clark saw his eyes. Not wide like a scared child, not wild like a feral thing. Just still, empty. The ones who stayed, the boy whispered. Clark felt something cold crawl up his spine. He had spent years chasing killers, monsters who hid behind walls of lies and excuses, but this was different. This wasn't a mask he could peel off. The boy wasn't pretending. Whatever was inside him wasn't a child anymore. Clark stepped closer, the rain soaking his coat, his boots crunching in the mud. "You're coming with me," he said firmly, not shouting, just steady. The boy's lips curled, not into a smile, not quite, but into something colder, something that made Clark grip his gun without realizing it. Then the wind shifted, and Clark heard it. For the first time, he heard what the boy had been hearing all along. It wasn't a voice, not in any way he could describe. It was a sound beneath the sound, a low, hollow whisper that didn't come from the trees, or the house, or the boy's mouth. It came from everywhere at once. It slid into the air like smoke. It brushed against Clark's ears like cold fingers. And just like that, the street felt smaller, darker, tighter, as if the world was holding its breath around him. The boy's eyes flicked toward the Johnson house, and Clark followed his gaze. The front door was open. It shouldn't have been open. He had locked it himself. He'd checked twice. Now it hung slightly ajar, rain dripping down the porch steps, the darkness inside like a mouth waiting to swallow. Clark raised his flashlight and took a single step forward. The boy didn't follow. He stayed by the tree watching. "They're still inside," the boy whispered. Clark's light cut through the living room, illuminating the same untouched scene he had walked through dozens of times. The same pictures on the wall, the same toys on the carpet, the same empty kitchen, but something was different now. The air. It was colder, thicker, like the house itself was breathing. The door closed behind him with a soft click. He spun around, his flashlight trembling slightly in his hand. Clark moved through the house, slow and careful, every creak of the floorboards louder than the thunder outside. Upstairs, a door creaked open by itself. The kids' room. He could see the soft shape of the teddy bear on the floor, soaked from the rain coming through the cracked window. The whispering sound grew louder the closer he came to the room, not in words but in meaning. Like something was pressing against the edges of his thoughts, and for a moment, he saw it, tiny handprints on the walls, smudged and wet, like they'd been dragged there over and over. "Show yourself," Clark said softly, his voice steadier than his pulse. He'd faced worse than shadows before, but this wasn't just a killer anymore. This was something else. Then he heard footsteps behind him, small ones, barefoot on wet wood. He turned slowly, expecting the boy. But there was no one there. Just the empty hallway, the rain tapping against the window and the sound of soft breathing right behind his ear. He spun again, gun drawn, and there he was. The boy, standing at the end of the hall, head tilted, water dripping down his pale face. "You shouldn't be here," the boy whispered. Clark kept the gun aimed, his flashlight catching the boy's eyes and making them gleam like shards of glass. "What did you do to them?" Clark asked, his voice low. The boy blinked slowly. "They didn't scream," he said simply, like it was an answer, like it was a memory he had replayed in his head 100 times. The whispering sound rose around them, louder, pressing like invisible hands. Clark took a slow step back, his shoulder brushing the wall. The boy took a slow step forward, barefoot on the wood, not making a sound. Rain pounded harder against the window. Wind howled through the cracks. But the only thing Clark really heard was that whisper, soft, endless, almost curious. Then, just as quickly as it began, the boy stopped moving. He tilted his head again, listening to something Clark couldn't hear anymore. Then he turned and walked back down the hall, his small frame swallowed by the shadows of the staircase. Clark didn't follow, not yet. His pulse was hammering in his ears, and he knew the truth now. This wasn't just a crime. It was something colder, something that had been festering here long before he arrived. When he finally stepped out of the house, the rain had stopped. The boy was gone. The oak tree stood silent and dripping. The world looked exactly the same. But Clark knew it wasn't. Whatever lived in that boy's eyes wasn't finished yet, and neither was he. That night, in the dim light of his motel room, with water still dripping from his coat, Clark loaded his gun slowly, methodically, The way a man does when he knows what's coming isn't going to end quietly. Outside, in a house not too far from Maple Street, a boy sat on his bed with wet hair and steady hands, humming the same sound Clark had heard in the dark and smiling faintly, like he was waiting for the next night to come. The sun never truly came out the next morning. It was the kind of pale light that didn't warm the ground, didn't chase away the fog, didn't make anyone feel safe. The kind of light that felt tired, as if the town itself had stayed awake all night and didn't want to get up. People moved slower, spoke softer, and avoided the windows, because every creak in the house, every gust of wind against the glass, every shadow on the porch now felt like something was watching. The name of the Johnson family was on everyone's lips, but so was a silence no one could shake. Even the birds seemed to stay away from Maple Street, as if they too felt something wrong growing there. Detective Clark hadn't slept. His eyes were bloodshot, his hands still shaking slightly from gripping his gun too long the night before. He replayed everything in his head, how the door opened on its own, how the house felt alive, how the boy's empty stare didn't flinch when the storm surrounded him. He had hunted murderers before, but nothing like this. Nothing so cold, nothing so quiet. He sat in the motel with the blinds half closed, his notes scattered on the table, pictures of the Johnsons staring back at him. But all he could see was that boy standing barefoot in the rain like the world already belonged to him. He knew he couldn't treat this like a regular case anymore. He couldn't wait for backup, couldn't keep chasing shadows while more families slept with their doors unlocked and their porch lights pretending to protect them. This wasn't going away on its own, and the boy wasn't hiding. He wanted Clark to see him. He wanted Clark to follow, and that was what terrified Clark most. Not what was hidden, but what was standing in plain sight. By evening, the town felt like a held breath. The storm hadn't returned, but the air was heavy, thick, the clouds low and swollen. People gathered at the diner, whispering theories about outsiders, about cults, about cursed land, anything that kept them from looking at their neighbors too closely. Clark walked through the door and every voice went quiet, the way people go silent when they see someone carrying the weight of something they don't want to face. He didn't say much, just ordered black coffee, stood by the window and looked out at Maple Street in the distance. That oak tree haunted him now. He could see its outline even when he closed his eyes. The sheriff tried to talk to him again, tried to calm him down, told him not to make everyone panic, but Clark wasn't listening. "It's not over," he said flatly. "It's never been over. It started long before that family disappeared." He didn't tell the sheriff about the whispering, about the door that opened itself, about the way the boy had looked at him as if he was the one being hunted. He didn't have to. The sheriff already knew something wasn't right. He just didn't want to say it out loud. That night, Clark parked on Maple Street one last time, this time closer, engine still running, his revolver heavy in his lap. The air outside was thick with that strange quiet that comes before something breaks. He could hear the leaves of the oak tree rustling even though the wind wasn't blowing. Midnight passed slow, each minute a long stretch of stillness. Then, just like before, a shape appeared at the edge of the road. The boy, barefoot again, not shivering, not hiding, standing in the middle of the street like he owned the night. This time Clark didn't wait. He stepped out, boots pressing against the wet pavement, his heart steady but heavy. The boy didn't run, didn't even flinch. He just tilted his head like he was listening to something only he could hear. "Why me?" Clark asked quietly, his voice sharp through the fog. "Why this house?" The boy blinked slowly. "Because you heard them too," he whispered. His voice so soft it didn't belong to someone human. It belonged to the same silence that had swallowed the Johnsons. Clark took another step closer, the oak tree looming behind the boy like a black shadow with roots, and that whispering returned. Not outside now, but inside his head, crawling through the back of his skull like cold water. Words he couldn't understand but felt, pressing against his chest, wrapping around his breath. He gritted his teeth and aimed the flashlight at the boy's face. The boy didn't look away. His eyes didn't even blink. "What did you do to them?" Clark growled. The boy's lips moved slowly, carefully. They didn't scream, they just stopped. And then the front door of the Johnson house opened. Again. Clark didn't take his eyes off the boy, but he could feel the door moving, could hear the hinges creak, could feel the air shift like something bigger was exhaling. The boy stepped backward, disappearing into the dark porch like a shadow returning home, and Clark followed. His gun was raised now, flashlight cutting through the darkness. The floorboards groaned beneath his boots. The house smelled like damp wood and something else. Something old. Something wrong. The living room was the same, untouched. The air was not. It pressed on him like a living thing. And then he heard it. Footsteps upstairs, small, barefoot. Clark moved slowly, steady, every step louder than it should have been, his light catching the walls, the pictures, the stairs. The whispering crawled up his neck now, closer, as if it was standing right behind him. When he reached the top of the stairs, he saw them. Not the boy, the Johnson family. Or what was left of them, 3 figures standing at the end of the hallway. Their faces pale, their eyes empty, their clothes soaked as if they'd walked out of the river. But they didn't move like people. They moved like echoes. Clark froze. He'd seen dead bodies before, but never ones that stared back without blinking. Never ones that moved in perfect silence. Behind them, the boy appeared. Small. Calm. His head tilted like always. "They're not gone," he whispered. "They're mine now." Clark's hand shook on the trigger, the weight of his revolver suddenly feeling useless. "What are you?" Clark whispered back, but the boy didn't answer. He stepped closer, and the whispering in Clark's skull grew so loud it felt like it was eating him alive from the inside. The figures of the Johnson family faded like fog as the boy walked past them. His steps silent, water dripping from his feet onto the floorboards. The house groaning under a weight Clark couldn't see. The flashlight flickered. The walls creaked. And the boy whispered one last thing as he passed him by, his voice soft and flat. "You can't stop what's already inside." When the light steadied again, the hallway was empty. No boy, no family, no sound except Clark's own ragged breathing. He stumbled back down the stairs into the street, into the pale light of the dying street lamps, the oak tree looming above him like a black wound against the sky. He dropped to his knees on the wet road, the whisper still echoing somewhere deep in his head. Something he knew would never leave him now. The next morning, the sheriff found Clark sitting outside the Johnson house with hollow eyes and mud on his boots. "Where is he?" the sheriff asked, panic in his voice. Clark didn't answer. He didn't need to. The boy was gone. The house was quiet again. The tree swayed gently in the breeze. Weeks passed. The case went cold. The town pretended to move on. But doors locked earlier now. Lights stayed on longer. Children whispered about seeing a boy at the edge of the cornfields, barefoot, silent, watching. And sometimes, late at night when the wind slid through Maple Street just right, people swore they heard soft footsteps and a small voice whispering in the dark. They didn't scream. Detective Clark left South Dakota, but the whisper followed him like a shadow stitched behind his ribs, a sound that would wake him in the middle of the night, a sound that wasn't just a memory but a promise, because monsters don't always die. Sometimes they walk away in the rain barefoot and smiling, and sometimes they wait,